Welcome. Hello. My name is Nicole Van Rootselaar, and today I'd like to discuss talking for cognitive development, how speech articulation relates to executive function and social competency in preschool children. Now, because this is a phonology conference, I'm going to assume that many of you are familiar with the early speech sound development in preschool children and define a few other topics used in my presentation. The first topic is executive function. Executive function refers to a host of skills that are vital for success both in early school years and later on in life. They include skills such as working memory, which refers to the ability to hold and manipulate information in your mind, cognitive flexibility, the ability to engage alternate means of thinking about an experience, inhibitory control, the ability to maintain focus on and pursue a goal in the face of distraction, specifically by inhibiting the impulse to follow the distraction. And finally, we have emotional control, which refers to emotional valence or is a visceral element that can drive decision making. When you look at those four categories, it's easy to see how a preschool child is going to be tested and given opportunity to develop all of those different skills. When you're going out and just starting to play with a new toy in a new classroom, you have to use your working memory to recall the rules that the teacher just gave you, cognitive flexibility to figure out how to play with these new and exciting toys, and then inhibitory control and emotional control if a classmate comes along and decides that they want to play with those same toys, and you have to navigate how to share, how to find a different toy. Now, there's a lot of social play coming into that specific example as well, which leads me to my other skill I'd like to discuss, social competence, which refers to the capacity of an individual to meaningfully interact with others and incorporates cognitive, emotional, and behavioral skills. We usually assess social competence through two different measures. The first is initiations, which refers to spontaneous, non-mediated social interaction and can be done through verbal initiations by going up and starting a conversation with someone, or nonverbal by just using body language that suggests you're open and ready to communicate. The second element is social engagement, which is the use of appropriate behavior in different social contexts. Again, very similar and very much overlapping with some of the elements that I just described that executive function plays a role in. Now, given the importance of both of these skills, both in a preschooler's life and an adult's life, our lab has studied executive function before. And in this study, we looked at 4 to 6-year-old children and their executive function as measured by the brief questionnaire, which was completed by parents. The brief is a 60-question questionnaire that asks parents to rate how often their child exhibits different behaviors. An example question is, how often does your child resist changes to routine? And parents can answer never, often, or sometimes. We also looked at a child's articulatory skills and did this by recording them producing different words and looked at the S and esh, as in salmon and ship. We took the mean spectral frequency and expected a greater distance for children who had clear articulations because esh should have a higher frequency compared to esh. And before I show the results, I'd like to mention that children who had a lower brief score had better executive function. So when you look at the findings, you can note that children with that lower brief score or better executive function also had a greater distance between their mean spectral frequencies of their S and esh, so better articulation. In relation to my introduction slide, there's a whole body of literature that has compared social competence and executive function. One very recent study I'd like to share with you. The authors asked children to complete a child attention shifting task where they were to press a spacebar if they saw either a happy face or an angry face in the pair of cards, and they had to inhibit the urge to press the spacebar if they saw 2 neutral faces. 2 other measures that the investigators recruited or investigators looked at were done by the teachers, where they asked teachers to rate a child's social cooperation, which is how well the child exhibits socially appropriate behaviors such as turn taking, and also rate the child's negative emotionality, or how frequently the child exhibits behaviors like aggression. If we look at the relationship or interaction between effortful control or executive function and a child's social cooperation and negative emotionality. You can see that their findings suggest that children who had better executive function, as indicated by the solid black line, they were 1 standard deviation above the mean. They had better social cooperation, even if they had high negative emotionality, especially compared to those who had below average effortful control or executive function. This background literature leads me to my present research question. My present research question is that in young children, is there a relationship between articulation and social competence? My hypothesis is that if phonetic development is linked to executive function and executive function is linked to social competency, we would observe a connection between acoustic differentiation and social competency. In other words, I believe that children who possess better phonetic production knowledge will also possess better executive function and social competency. To test this, we so far have recruited 27 children between the ages of 3 to 6 years old. We have a couple of different measures that I'll explain in more detail later on, but first I'd like to give a summary. For speech, we looked at, like that initial study that I mentioned, their articulation differentiation, their ability to produce and distinguish between the S and sh sounds. For their executive function, we had parents complete the brief questionnaire and also included 2 interactive measures of the children and had them complete animal Stroop and a Lego model construction task. And finally, for social competence, we had parents complete 2 questionnaires, the SRS2 and the ASQ-SE, as well as engaged in an unstructured Lego dyad building task with the children. For the speech measure, children produced a list of different words. We recorded them. We were focused mostly on the target sounds, so words beginning with S or esh. And after recording, we can extract the acoustic spectral centroid frequency, which is defined as the weighted mean frequency of the sound noise spectrum. This gives us a quantifiable number that we can use to assess how well the children are differentiating their production of these 2 sounds. If I was to show you an example from a previous publication, here we're looking at a child that does not have very clear speech. The mean spectral frequency, as indicated by the dotted lines, red for them trying to pronounce sheet versus black for them trying to pronounce seat, has almost no distance, suggesting that their seat and sheet would sound nearly identical. This is a second child who had much more clear speech and would likely be able to clearly differentiate their pronunciations of seat and sheet. In terms of executive function measures, I mentioned animal Stroop. For animal Stroop, children go through about 12 cards and name normal animals like pig and sheep, and immediately after go through 12 cards and have to name silly animals. They're asked to name the body and inhibit the urge to name the head, which is where children will naturally look for cues about what kind of animal it is. So instead of saying sheep, they would be expected to say pig for this card. Our main variable of interest for this game is the percent time. So we looked at how long it took them to complete the silly cards compared to how long it took them to complete the normal cards. Our second measure of executive function was a Lego model construction task. Here the child has been asked to replicate one of 4 different models, and how we related this to executive function, there you can see the matching model. For executive function, we looked at the percent grasping errors. So we counted how many times they performed a grasp which did not assist them in correctly assembling the model. There, she thought about picking up the pink block, but ended up not picking it up. If she had grasped it, we would have counted it as a grasping error because she did not need another pink block to complete the model. We believe this relates to elements of executive function like working memory and inhibition. And finally, for social competency, children completed the unstructured Lego dyad building task, where they were asked to sit together at a table with another child and given a bucket of Lego and instructed to build something together for 5 minutes. To measure them or assess their social competency, we had 3 different categories we rated them on: the type of play, their interaction, and their affect. and summed together, this resulted in a social competency score. I'll give you guys a better idea of what this looked like. So here in this pair, we have two children who are doing the task. They're engaged in parallel play, so not working together, both working on their own towers. In terms of interaction, there's almost no communication. They're trying very hard to ignore each other. And their affect is neutral, trending towards negative, as the boy in the black shirt tries to rip away the block and then the bottom of the blue shirt boy's tower. So they both receive a very low score for this interaction. This contrasts really well with my group who did much better. In this video, you'll see they're engaging in cooperative play, both working on building a barn together. The volume is turned off, but they're making lots of child-directed bids and planning on how they want to use lots of red, and how the one boy is working on building a door. And there's lots of positive affect. There's some laughing and giggling later on. So they both receive very high scores of 9 for this video. Now onto my results. First, I wanted to look at the relationship between executive function measures and articulation. So here on the y-axis, we have the acoustic distance between S and Sh, and we are looking at comparing it to the grasping errors from the Lego construction grasp. So greater percentage of grasping errors means they were more inaccurate when building. And my results suggest that children who made more errors while building tended to have a smaller distance between their S and Sh, so poorer phonetic knowledge, and better phonetic knowledge if they made fewer grasping errors during the Lego construction task. If we look at the Stroop time and the relationship between Stroop time and articulation, you see the same trend where children who took almost twice as long or 3 times as long to complete the silly Stroop task were the ones who tended to have smaller acoustic distance between their S and Sh, or poorer articulation. I highlighted the P and R value in red to indicate that this relationship is not quite significant yet, but is trending there, and we hope that'll change as we test more children. And my final result, what is the relationship between acoustic distance for S and Sh production and their social competence rating? We found a significant positive correlation in which children who had a higher social competence rating also had a greater distance between their S and Sh. In other words, articulation was significantly related to active measures of social competence, and articulation was also related to measures of executive function. If you remember from my methods slide, I did mention several parent-completed questionnaires and did not cover those in the results. That's because articulation was not related to parent questionnaire measures of executive function or social competency. While disappointing, this result is not surprising, as we have found in the past that when we use interactive measures where we are assessing the child's actual behavior and compare it to parent questionnaire measures, we don't always see that relationship between how parents believe their children behave and how the children actually behave during a task. And my last question that I'd like to leave you with is it possible to determine the role of speech in the development of executive function and social skills? What I really mean by this is, what I'd like to know is the development simultaneous or linear of all of these 3 skills? When you're looking at an infant or a young child that's just learning to babble, just gaining their first words, are they at a similar level of development in their speech as their executive function and social skills? Or is it possible that if speech is those first early thing to appear before executive function and social skills, does that open the door for early speech intervention in a babbler or a child just learning to talk? And will we see huge gains later on in the development of their executive function and social skills? Thank you for coming to my talk and watching, and I look forward to any questions you might have.